William Lloyd Mackenzie King was the Canadian Prime Minister for a total of 22 years throughout his time. King was liberal and appealed to the general population, which won him the 1921 and 1926 election. Mackenzie King was very successful in office. He especially appealed to farmers in Ontario, and Canada became constitutionally equal to Britain during his term in office. In 1929, the United States stock market crashed, which sent North America into an economic depression because of North America's close business relationship. King was reluctant to accept the scale of the Great Depression and so lost to R.B. Bennett, who promised aggressive action in response to the Great Depression. But R.B. Bennett would not be able to promise his aggressive promises. During the Canadian Great Depression, 30% of the labor force was out of work. Public and private expenditure fell by 42%, and one-fourth of Canadians depended on the government for survival. With these extreme situations in mind, it is safe to say there was a lot of work to be done by R.B. Bennett, but this would not be the case. R.B. Bennett promised aggressive actions for the Great Depression, but didn't because it was very difficult to convince his office to side with his decisions. During R.B. Bennett's rule, he set up relief camps that resulted in the large rebellions like the On to Ottawa Trek. He created a Bank of Canada to help regulate currency, and realizing his policies were not working, Bennett promised his New Deal if he was elected again. He would not be elected again, and Mackenzie King would take his place and lead Canada into World War II.
Japanese-Canadian internment goes back all the way to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, as with the U.S. Mackenzie King called for the internment of all ethnically Japanese living inside Canada. Those who resided in the camps at Hastings Park were placed in stables and barnyards. They lived with zero privacy in an unsanitary environment. The internees attested to the intense cold during the winter. World War II could have been an opportunity for the Japanese Canadians to prove their loyalty to Canada by joining the military. However, the Canadian government rejected many of their applications. Any who managed to serve in the war were shortly discharged and were unable to retain their citizenship.
Prime Minister Mackenzie King issued a ruling that all property would be removed from Japanese Canadian inhabitants. The custodian of aliens held auctions for these possessions, which included farmland, homes, and clothing. Mackenzie King hoped that by selling these possessions at very low prices, it would deter the Japanese Canadians away. The Canadian government launched a royal commission led by Justice Henry Bird in 1947 to discuss compensation for confiscated property. In 1950, the Bird Commission awarded $1.3 million in claims to over 1,000 Japanese Canadians, but this was only based on loss of property. They refused to acknowledge wrongdoing in terms of civil rights, loss of earnings, and lack of education. Prior to the Quiet Revolution, French Canada was seen as backward, rural, and less educated. In the 1960s, French Canadians in Quebec increased movement to the cities and went away from conservative Catholic values. They demanded secularization and modernization of cities and schools, and they resented the dominance of wealthy English-speaking Canadians in their province. The revolution was led by the Liberal Union National Party. During the revolution, Quebec increased taxes and spent more to provide modern services to their population. In 1962, they nationalized the power of Hydro-Quebec, and the government took over gas, water, and electrical services to a lower cost to the people. The revolution saw a great change in the city of Montreal, in which education would be transformed away from churches, and there were increased teaching standards to a national level, especially giving a higher level to French education. In 1974, the Official Language Act recognized French as the official language of Quebec. All these actions made the city of Montreal a modern city with a vibrant economy and an educated population.
John Diefenbaker was the 13th Prime Minister of Canada. He He served from 1957 to 1963 for the Progressive Conservative Party. In 1956, that's when he was chosen to succeed George Drew. Diefenbaker extended voting rights to First Nations. First Nations are Native people in Canada who are not Métis or Inuit. For the first time, First Nations were given the right to vote. Diefenbaker was greatly determined to guarantee civil rights to all. Diefenbaker also nominated James Gladstone to be the first abnormal member of the Senate, and he also appointed the first female cabinet member, Ellen Faircloth, as Secretary of State.
Diefenbaker's stance on nuclear weapons interfered with U.S. policies. The U.S. wanted to place missiles in Canada, while Diefenbaker refused to spread the use of nuclear weapons.
Another main policy that Diefenbaker began was creating the Economic Council. It was created in 1963, and its role was to assess medium and long-term prospects of the economy. They also considered ways of strengthening Canada's international, financial, and trade positions, study the effects of economic growth and technological change on employment and income, explored policies to foster regional development, and they studied the means of increasing Canadian participation in the ownership, control, and management of industries in Canada.
The Bill of Rights of 1960 gave Canadian citizens the right to equality before the law and equal protection under the law. It also included freedom of religion, speech, assembly, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. The Bill of Rights helped advance and protect human rights of Canadian citizens.
While Lester Pearson was in office, he cut money from defense for social programs. The Canada Student Loans Program allowed low-cost loans for university or trade school. The Canadian Pension Plan allowed more benefit in retirement, and provinces could enact their own plans with federal money. The Medicare Act allowed universal health care for all Canadians, and they used federal money to provide equal health care in all provinces.
The October Crisis. The October Crisis started when the FLQ, a leftist radical French-Canadian independence group, kidnapped British Trade Commissioner James Cross. The government, as a result, implemented a War Measures Act, which allowed the use of military force, declared the FLQ illegal, and suspected association was a reason for their arrest. Civil liberties were suspended as the government refused to negotiate with the kidnappers. As a result of the Canadian government's actions, the FLQ kidnapped and actually killed the Minister of Labour. The Canadian government eventually found the FLQ hideout. People were confident that Trudeau, as a French-Canadian himself, would be able to control the crisis. Unfortunately, this was not the case. The British Trade Commissioner was eventually released by negotiating with his kidnappers. 5 of said kidnappers eventually ended up being flown to Cuba.